Hello everyone and welcome to The Sydneyist, a weekly conversation about the city we love. We like here to apply much curiosity, a dash of cheek and definitely no whinging. Thank you to Tony for the promo and to our wonderful producer Sophie Kennedy-White. We are here broadcasting from the Ellen Slate studio in the very glamorous basement of Eastside Radio on 89.7 FM or streaming on eastsidefm.org. Tonight we're talking architecture. For most of this century, architects have been governed by their own act. Now the government wants to abolish that act. I will be talking in a minute to this longest title in the world, Institute of Architects New South Wales chapter past president and president-elect of the Institute of Architects federal body, Adam Haddow, about what this abolition will mean for architecture and also for the city that we live in. First, though, we have a few snippets of news about planning and city making. The first plane, you might have noticed, has taken off from Western Sydney International Airport. A Piper PA-30 twin Comanche aircraft yesterday performed a number of repeated takeoffs and landings in a test procedure for the 3,000 ground lights on the runway, so that is in hand. I don't know when we're actually going to be able to use it. Meanwhile, the NIMBY-YIMBY argument is becoming more complicated as anti-development pushes in places like Potts Point, Bondi and Paddington fight to protect long-term low-income residents rather than replacing them with luxury versions. In particular, the boarding houses of Selwyn Street and Paddington have become controversial, where the owner, LFD Developments, proposes to evict a community of 29 men, in this case, from houses that have been their homes for decades. I think we might come back to this issue in a future episode. At the same time, we're fast becoming a society of landlords, with half of the lower house federal MPs and 40% of senators owning investment properties. So do we really think anyone's ever going to get around to abolishing negative gearing, as we all know they should? And in Woollahra, closer to home, residents have voted in a referendum not to reduce the number of councillors from 15 to 9. I'm not sure why this matters. It did hit the news. The Sydney Morning Herald reports that Woollahra and Hunters Hill, which are the wealthiest suburbs, are also the most highly represented. So it makes it sound like something that you really want a lot of councillors, but I don't know if that's really something that you need all that many of. Anyway, maybe there's a correlation, maybe there's not. Perhaps there's an advantage in having lots and lots of councillors in your area, or perhaps it's just fun. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly, and I'm here with you on The Sydneyist at Eastside Radio 89.7 FM, and my guest this evening to talk about Abolishing the Architects Act 2003 is past president of the AIA New South Wales chapter, Adam Haddow. Adam, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for being here. So look, the government proposes to repeal your act. I can remember, I don't know if you can remember, I can remember when this act was invented, and everyone was very excited because architects suddenly had their own acts and it made them feel very special and very loved. But also, of course, it made them feel like a proper profession to have an enabling act with a proper code of conduct and all the sort of stuff that applies. So how will it... Well, first of all, let's talk about why an act matters. What does it bring?
So the Act brings a level of, I suppose, consumer protection. It clarifies who can call themselves an architect and what it means to be an architect. So every architect in this state is required to finish a university degree of a minimum of 5 years, then do 2 years, a minimum of 2 years of work experience, which is monitored by a senior member of the profession, and then sit a written exam and a verbal exam to be able to then become registered. And part of the registration requirement is you also then need to keep up with professional development. So you're needing to keep yourself educated throughout your entire career. So it is important. It ensures that there's a level of, I suppose, certainty around what it means to be an architect and what a consumer it grows to expect. Absolutely. And at the same time, it manages architects. So it puts in some disciplinary procedures for architects who aren't acting within the code. It ensures.
Do they ever get exercised?
Yeah, absolutely, they do. So there are the Architects Registration Board actually in New South Wales is probably renowned as being one of the most well-regulated, well-organised registration boards globally. It's seen as best practice within the industry. And
that's the board that Paul Keating used to be on. Is he still on it?
No, he's not on it. No,
he was for a while, wasn't he?
He was for a little while, yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think he was at least. But importantly, when the board makes a decision against an architect, that has never been overturned. So in the process of making recommendations about architects, should they be deregistered or should they be fined or should they be placed on a behaviour bond or whatever the outcome or the ruling is of that of the registration board, it has never been overturned, which I think is a really significant indication of how well it's organised and run.
So how is it different? Like, I think, you've talked about being registered and how that is important, and that establishes architecture as a profession, I imagine, which is what we think of it as being one of the kind of noble professions like medicine or law, and that's how we're sort of taught to think, I suppose. But architecture obviously has been around since, I guess the Parthenon or something, and we think of that long lineage. But is it actually different from being, say, a bricklayer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a clear definition between a job and a profession. A job you get paid for, you take home a paycheck. A profession, you have a salary, and that talks to a broader requirement of your role, which in an architectural sense is about your responsibility to the broader society, not just your client. So you are required to consider not only the needs or requirements of the person who's paying you, but also the needs and requirements of society more generally.
So is that in the Act, that requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. So and all the acts. Interestingly, in Australia, because we're a federation of states, each state has its own act, and they all have different variations of what it means to be an architect and how you get registered. But importantly, we have mutual recognition across the country, and even now we have mutual recognition with the United Kingdom, the US, I think with Singapore, Canada. And that mutual recognition is super important because it opens up free trade agreements between the countries. It means you can the architects from there can work here without having to go through the same registration process again. And the other kind of element of the importance of that is that not only does the registration board register architects, they also go and look at the schools of architecture at universities and accredit them to teach it. So they're making sure that the students that come through a university and come out with an architecture degree have a certain basic minimum standard of competency so that they can enter into the profession and then contribute obviously to the profession.
So I'm interested in this question of civic responsibility, if we call it that, because if you, I understand what you say and it's a very nice idea, but if you're an architect working for a developer, then it's pretty hard to say, but what about, isn't that pretty awful for the people in there? Or what about the street? Don't you think you should spend more money on making it decent?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's always you can always find the positive and negative in the grey, right? There's always the potential to kind of look to a project and think, well, that didn't think about the civic good.
But that's a kind of conflict, isn't it?
It is a conflict, but I think it's the ultimate challenge, right? It's the ultimate challenge to find the end in the project, right? The client gives you a brief, and there's a written brief that's an expectation that they're giving you to deliver for them. But then there's also a broader societal brief about what it means for the city more broadly, and it's often a really challenging thing to deal with, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be dealt with. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it. It means that we just have to think about it more vigorously, with more time and with more effort.
I remember hearing Peter Stutchbury, I think it was, talking about educating your client, and I used to think, good luck with that.
Yeah.
But I suppose there is something in that. Do architects find themselves kind of sneaking good things into the?
Timothy Hill talks about it. I think he's one of Australia's best architects. He talks about the rabbit, the fox, and the hare, and there's two different ways to get to the end point, and sometimes that's slow and methodical, and sometimes it's just doing it without necessarily someone noticing, and both have their relevance, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, it is finding that line between between what is the kind of objective of your client, the person who's paying you, and then the broader objective of what does it mean for society and the city.
Yeah, of course, in New South Wales, we're very cynical.
We are very cynical.
Understandably, based on experience, which is that, it's a nice idea that the client and the client's interests and the civic interests would be the same, but we all know that for a lot of clients, particularly a lot of developers, that it's really just bottom line stuff, and they just want it cheaply, and that's one of the things that's undermined architecture over the years, and it turned it from being much less of a profession than it was probably 100 years ago, say.
Yeah.
That sort of gentlemanly idea of you do all the drawings and then it just gets built the way you said.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen anymore. So that whittling away of the profession's already happened for quite a while, hasn't it?
We live in a really complex world, and the kind of environment where, an architect would draw a whole project on 3 drawings and it would be built exactly the way it was drawn.
Yeah, by master builders who
who are qualified. That has changed. And I suppose the complexity of society means the complexity of the buildings we deliver and the nature of the way in which we have to deliver them, the regulation that's around them. I mean, we live in a city or state that has possibly some of the most rigorous regulations around apartment buildings in the world. Like, bar none, New South Wales has the best minimum standards of apartments in the world.
And yet still so many of them are so awful.
Yeah, but I think that it's
How
important.
does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I don't know any developer who gets up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to do a bad job today. Right? So no one does that. No architect does that.
That's more upsetting.
Yeah, well, maybe. But I think, in the end, it's about, there's a societal challenge about how do we bring together the requirements of the broader society, and particularly in Sydney and New South Wales, about housing. How do we deal with housing? Yes. How do we deal with the quantum of housing we have to deal with at a price point that people can afford and still make it good? And there's lots of different ways of doing that. And I suppose what you see often in Sydney is built research. So people trying different things to try and achieve the same outcome. Sometimes they're successful, highly successful and remarkable outcomes, and sometimes they're not. And I think we need to ensure that we don't kind of drive out that innovation and that desire to test through building, because we also don't want our city to look exactly the same. We don't want every apartment building to be the same. We don't want it to be just kind of a mock Tudor number because people feel comfortable about that. We do want the architecture to be of its time, of its place, and say something about us, to kind of represent who we are as a people at this point in time and what makes us tick, really.
But there's a difference, isn't there, between aesthetic standards, which personally I would have none of, and rules that are made to protect public health and well-being.
Absolutely. And look, New South Wales standards are all about the latter, not the former. They're all about, or majority of them are about, how do we make sure that the minimum standards are
so
appropriate.
The minimum window sizes and
that there's sunlight and cross-ventilation, and we don't kind of... We ensure that people can move into an apartment and not be paying exorbitant energy prices for the rest of their lives. So, they're often quite simple things, but they make a big difference to the people's health and well-being when they end up living there. Okay,
so let's talk about the current Act, the 2003 Act. So what difference did it make when it was brought in?
Well, I wasn't actually here at the time, so
no,
that's
you
kind
were
of
probably about 4 years old.
No, I was living in Sydney and I was working as an architect. But I think I was very early in my career, and it kind of happened. I was from Victoria originally, and it kind of just happened in New South Wales, and I wasn't, I suppose, as cognizant. There had always been some regulation around architecture, but majority of that was held within the Government Architect's Office or with the government itself. And then there was a kind of big review into that to ascertain what was important about regulation of architects. And then out of that review in 2000, I think it was 2003, the current Act was enforced by the government. And I think what it's been able to do is, I suppose, create some clarity around what it is to be an architect, what are your responsibilities as an architect, and talk about the way not only architects engage with society and what it means to be providing an architectural service, but also how architects engage with each other to ensure that there's a more collegiate sense of the profession, in that we kind of see ourselves collectively and that we're all working towards creating a better place for the public of Sydney. It's
interesting, isn't it, that we still, as far as I know, we still don't protect the title engineer, and anyone can call themselves an engineer, which seems more dangerous in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's what this act, that's the challenge of this act. So the government's ambition in the building bill, which is the process, the new one, which is the process of repealing the Architects Act and replacing the building bill, is to regulate the unregulated. And so that's engineers, interior designers, building designers. And they're trying to ensure that I suppose a level of rigour that exists around the architects also exists around other parts of the profession that contribute to the built environment.
So that's the purpose of this new bill.
It's one of the purposes. The government, we kind of asked this question a couple of times, but essentially they're taking 7 or 9 existing pieces of legislation and folding them into a single piece of legislation which deals with the act of building. And it came out of the Building Commissioner's Office as a response to some of the loss of confidence consumers had around apartments. Absolutely, dodgy buildings. To try and bolster support or bolster consumer confidence around that, they've said, well, we need to look at regulating a broader sector of the built environment professions, not just the architects.
Although, of course, architects weren't really very strongly implicated in most of the dodgy buildings.
No, correct. And I mean, some of the actions by the Building Commissioner have been really fantastic for architects. They've given us it has given us a lot more control over what happens on site. It's put us back into the driving seat in a lot of cases. So there are some very good things that have happened out of it. It's required more regulation, a bit more red tape, but ultimately I think we are getting better results out of it.
Okay. We're going to stop for a little music break at that point, and then we'll come back and have some more talk about the detail.
I found happiness. Yes, yes. Where I left it last. Underneath the fancy trees, looking out on Era Beach. You know I need these barefoot days, shadow hopping through the haze. You know I need these long, hot days. Guitars are playing, people singing songs the free slave sings. In that cool place, watching waves break, the sun keeps. In that cool place, the sun keeps on shining. Close to me, underneath my favorite tree, in that cool place, watching waves break.
That's a track called Cool Place by King Tide from an album also called Cool Place from Big Island Records, 2022. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly, here with you on the Sydneyist at Eastside Radio 89.7 FM, and I'm speaking with Adam Haddow, President-elect of the Federal Institute of Architects in Australia and past President of the New South Wales chapter of the same organisation. So, Adam, we're talking about abolishing this, the Architects Act, which the government proposes to do quite imminently. A lot of architects are quite upset about this. There's been quite a lot of controversy, not surprisingly, because it's a very nice thing, really, to have your own enabling act. What will it change exactly, the abolition of this act and the replacement by the Building Act?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. So the discussion we've been having with government is that their intent is to lift and shift the Act, so to literally pick it up and place it in a different location, and to modernise it, to obviously change some wording and to bring it up to speed with some definitions, things like that. It happened quite quickly, so they didn't really give us any advance notice. They just kind of said this was going to happen. So I think that's why the architects, the profession at least, was incredibly...
A bit mistrustful.
Absolutely. It was a bit mistrustful. But the intent is to pretty much keep what exists, just to put it in a different place. Now, we've been working in good faith with government to try and make sure that happens as the Institute of Architects. But you know, I'm kind of excited to say that it's going in the right direction. But the proof will be in the pudding. You know, the proof happens when they release the new draft to us in early February.
So there are a number of differences, aren't there? One of them is that, there's been a lot of talk about the Code of Ethics, which is part of the existing Act.
Yes.
And seems, from my reading, and you might have a better view of this, to be in the new Act, but it's a may, not a must.
Yeah, there's a few bits that maybe the government thought they'd picked up correctly and moved across correctly, and they hadn't, and we've made them very aware of that. We're like, oh, no, that shouldn't be a may, that needs to be a must.
A syllable makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely makes a big difference. And I think, you know, there's two components to this. There's the Act and then there's the regulations that follow. And, you know, the Act itself does part of the work, but the heavy lifting is really done the regulations. And you know, in the discussions we're having with government, is that they are intending to ensure that all of those things, the musts rather than the mights, do exist within the document. But we are, you know, we want to make sure ultimately that consumers are protected, that actually the kind of trust that's been built up around the profession and the trust that has been rebuilt in the apartments since the Building Commissioner became involved, it grows, right? We don't want to erode that. At the time and place when we're building, where we need to build more apartments in Sydney than we've ever built.
That trust is growing? Because it's not.
I definitely think it's grown since the kind of tragedy of different buildings. Almost. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely been growing since then, and I think there is a greater sense of knowledge around what's happening within the industry, at least, so you know, there's light on it, so we understand it more. Architects definitely have more control over what's happening on sites now compared to pre.
Do they?
Absolutely. We're required to sign off drawings that builders cannot build things that are not drawn on our drawings. So where builders used to be able to do D&C, and it was like what we had drawn, and we had very little control over that. There is no capacity for that anymore. Really, they must build what we draw, and
somebody checks that.
Somebody checks that. Absolutely, the Building Commissioner checks that, and we're required to check it. We're required to sign off on it. You know,
that was, in theory, that was always sort of happening, but it wasn't really.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the procurement process that happened, that kind of came about in the kind of mid 2000s, I suppose, the design and construct, where you know, you would tender a building with some drawings, and then the builder could make the rest up in a little bit of way. You know, had a good intent. It was
take
essentially
out all the good bits.
Yeah, correct. You know, the intent was good. It was like actually get some contractors involved in the process so that we don't, you know, document something that maybe could be done better or cheaper in a different way. But it did take a lot of control away from architects. So the Building Commissioner has put a lot of that back into architects' hands. It's also put it into facade engineers, structural engineers. So where there was very little sign-off from them, there's now a lot more.
So it's not the architects who go on site to inspect what's being built, it's the Building Commissioner?
It's all of the above. So we're required to go on site and take notes and photograph it and upload that onto a website. The Building Commissioner can at any point in time go onto a site or come to our office and take the drawings and check that what the builder's drawings are and what our drawings are have been uploaded as the regulated set of drawings match.
Okay. Well, that sounds quite promising, I have to say. And you're confident that the ethics question, the Code of Ethics, Code of Conduct, whatever you call it, is going to be reinstated?
Am I confident? That's a good question, Elizabeth.
You sound quite sanguine.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Look, I think at the moment, I think the conversation is.
It'd be nice to have a Code of Conduct for developers.
It would be. It would be. I mean, I think we've suggested that actually. You know, we're alert but not alarmed at the moment, and I think we're alert to the idea that we're having these good, productive conversations where the government is telling us they're going to put all these things back into the building bill, but we're not yet alarmed. We could be alarmed, and we could get to February, and we could be calling on all of our members to kind of march down Macquarie Street, but we're not there yet. And I think, you know, there are very good elements of this bill that we think we're really supportive of, about the regulation of building designers, about the regulation of interior designers, about the regulation of engineers, and that will.
So will it license engineers or protect the term?
Well, it will require a certain minimum level of education and standard. It will require them to do professional development. That is a little bit in the ether at the moment, so that's what they're telling us. But, you know, for an example, in Australia, the Architects Act is a wholly independently regulated, so it's not regulated by the Institute of Architects. It's regulated by the Architects Registration Board of New South Wales, which are a government entity.
That seems like quite a good model to me. See, I don't know why you wouldn't just have an Engineers Act and an Interior Designers Act and whatever.
Well, I mean, I think what one of the options is actually to take the Architects Registration Board and actually morph it into a built environment registration board, where the kind of quality that exists under the Architects Act at the moment might then expand to take on how do we regulate building designers, how do we regulate engineers, how do we regulate interior designers.
Or it could have the opposite effect of just diluting the whole...
Yeah, it could. But I mean, I think you want, in an increasingly complex environment of construction, we need to be holding not only ourselves accountable, but the people that we collaborate with accountable. And that's really critical. Architects could do all the work in the world, but if an engineer or an interior designer does the wrong thing, it's very hard for us to then kind of,
It is interesting, isn't it, that if you look historically, that it seems to be so much more difficult. You say it's a more complex environment, and that's true, certainly in a legal and financial sense, I suppose. But it does seem, nevertheless, for all of our wealth and education and leisure and what have you, so much more difficult for us to build things that are reliable and useful and waterproof than ever before. And that's quite difficult to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ultimately because there's more of us living in less space, right? So we used to be...
Well, but the cities have been really dense. I mean, London was... I mean, some dreadful things were built, I suppose, as well. But
they were mostly low-rise or middle-rise cities. And we're now dealing with... exceptionally, and I would suppose people's levels of expectation were much lower, right? When the house I grew up in, the house I grew up in, we moved in without a floor, right? We had a dirt floor for a period of time, and my mum was like, okay, well, we'll just deal with that. But to think about that contemporarily, you think that could never happen anymore, So we have moved, and I think that's important to know.
Some ways in a good way, and some ways in a bad way.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so look, we're going to have to draw to a close quite soon, but so we still think of architecture as a profession. Do we still think of it as a noble profession, and will that continue?
Absolutely. Absolutely we do.
I like that confidence.
Yeah. Think of all the best places you've been in the world, and it's usually because there's an amazing piece of building there.
Is it? Yes, but was it designed by an architect?
Absolutely it was.
Oh, you would say that.
I would challenge you to pick out a building. Challenge you to pick out a building that is a remarkable piece of architecture that wasn't done by an architect.
I'm going to say Taj Mahal, but
maybe a long time ago. They were really an architect.
Well, yes, good try. Just quickly before we close, let's touch quickly, and we might come back to this, I think, in a future episode, but there's been a lot of hoo-ha too about the Productivity Commission's report into housing supply. What's your view of that and about, 60 seconds?
I'm far more worried about this than I am worried about the Architects Act. I think it's a hideous report with incredibly difficult incredibly terrible implications potentially for the people of New South Wales and for Sydney in particular. I think it's kind of potential dilution of the minimum standards of apartments and environmental standards in this state. It will be detrimental to the health and well-being of our citizens. So, it's something that we are rallying against, and we are forming a position on really quickly to ensure that the government doesn't take on some of those recommendations, because it's not only, it would be immoral for us to support the kind of recommendations that are in that act, in that report. Sorry.
It does more or less seem to say everything should be faster, bigger, cheaper, nastier, and uglier.
Yeah, I mean,
in order to have just more of it. But
it feels a bit like the Commission report was written. Well, it wasn't written with any input from architects at all. They didn't even meet with us, and
planners probably.
All planners. They didn't meet with the planners either. So
we will come back to that issue in the future. It's very interesting. I'm hoping that architects are going to be marching in the street about this. Nevertheless, it is a wrap, as they say. Thank you for listening, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly. I've been chatting with Institute of Architects President-elect Adam Haddow about repealing the Architects Act. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Sophie for producing us. We'll see you all next week. Bye. Hello, city dwellers. Ever wondered what makes Sydney tick? Well, hold on to your skyscrapers because the Sydneyist is about to unravel the secrets of the concrete jungle like never before. Together, we'll explore this vibrant metropolis from its foundations to its penthouses. We're not just talking about bricks and mortar, we're talking the soul of Sydney. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly. Join me Thursdays at 6 p.m. for The Sydneyist.